Happy Tuesday to everyone. You all count by the number of weeks that we have been in, and I guess it's probably about 8 or 9 weeks right now that we've been in. So I think if you're like me, you're getting a little house crazy, a little stir crazy, and you're looking for more excuses to get out. So I hope we have this over and we get back to seeing each other pretty soon. We're going to continue in the book of Ruth. By the way, if this is your first time here, my name is Norm Goss. I'm a retired senior pastor and seminary professor. I attend Beacon Evangelical Free Church on 6th Avenue in Galloway Township, New Jersey, and I've been retired about 10 years, and the Lord has me teaching Bible studies, kind of in-depth Bible studies during this time. So I hope you enjoy it, and we hope to see you back each week. Incidentally, this is week number 2 in Ruth. You can go back on the list at the Beacon website and see number 1 if you wish. We'll have 2 more, sessions 3 and 4 in the next 2 weeks, and then we'll take off for the summer, and we will come back about a week after Labor Day and start a new session. And we've pretty much come down to what the sessions will be. These Tuesday night sessions, whether they be in person at the church or whether they be online or both, will be covering the book of James at least from September until December. And then we'll decide later what we'll do from January to June. Sunday morning, assuming that we start back in person again, the adult journey class, some of you might know that as an adult Sunday school class, is the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the whole Corinthian culture and what Paul was writing about there. And we look forward to doing that. But for now, let's pray and let's get started with Ruth. Heavenly Father, we ask now that you would open our minds, open our hearts, open our ears, that we might not just hear words today, but we might hear you speaking through your word, the Bible, and through me, the teacher. I pray that you would guide me and give me the words that you would have me use. And I pray that we would all come out the other end of this Bible study with something to think about that would make our lives more godly and help us follow you more faithfully. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen. If you printed out your handout, you'll notice it's slightly different. For those of you who have ancient language ability, of course, there is the Hebrew column on the left, and then there's the English column in the middle. Now that English column is really not any particular translation. That's sort of my translation as I'm looking at other people's translations as I go through. And then the third column on the right is notes. Now the notes column is a little different this week. It's not as extensive, and there's a reason for that. Now that you saw last week how I did the notes, I've left a lot of blanks so you can fill in your ideas here as you think through this on your own, and we can make this a little more interactive. Remember, our whole concept here is that if we outline a piece of the Bible, a story, by thoughts, actually by phrases where there's a subject and a verb, and we keep going down and we place them under each other, and we indent them a little bit in certain instances, we can see exactly what's happening here, and we can see what are the key parts of moving the story along. And then what I've done is I've colorized it to give you an idea. What you see in the red here is they are simply the Hebrew signal and the verb to say, okay, we're moving to the next point. Now, it has nothing to do with time. It's just we're moving to the next point. I've said A, now I'm going to say B, then I'm going to say C. Occasionally, I have highlighted something in green. And green is a word that I think you should focus on a little bit because it's an important word in the scripture. It's an important word in this story of Ruth. If you'll remember last week, we covered quite a few years. We covered Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, moving from Bethlehem in Judah, right outside of Jerusalem, to the country of Moab. That's on the other side of the Jordan River. That would be in today's Jordan. And they did that because there was a famine. Now, it's odd to think that there is a famine and therefore no bread in a city that's called, or a town that's called, the house of bread. That's what Bethlehem means. Beth, house, lechem, bread. So the house of bread had no bread. And they move, about 20, 25 miles away, maybe a little bit more, maybe as much as 30. They go up the hill to Jerusalem, down the mountain to Jericho, cross over the Jordan River when there's not a lot of water running, and they go into an area, Moab. Now, if they were farming, in which it seems they were, they would have been in the but the beginning part of Moab before it rose up and become mountainous, and they probably would have been moved to the south a little bit along the Dead Sea. So all in all, they're probably 50 miles away from where they were. But you know what happens in the story. Elimelech dies, and the two sons evidently come of age. They marry two girls. Now, in Moab, the only girls you have to choose from are Moabite girls. So they married Moabite girls. And you say, well, how did they get along over there? Well, the interesting thing is that we have a couple pieces of royal messaging, things written on big blocks of rock. And one is called the Mesha Stone, and in that we find that the Moabite language is virtually identical to the Hebrew language. Probably the culture was similar as well. And so they marry these two girls. They stay married for about 10 years, and then the two husbands both die. We don't know why. Maybe some sort of virus went through, some sort of flu like what we're going through right now. And so we have an older woman and a younger woman, and two younger women presumably now in their mid-20s to late 20s. The mother in her 50s, and they're alone, and there's no one to take care of them. And in that culture, the male was the caretaker of the whole family, and without the male, there wasn't anybody to look after them. So now we come to, by the way, they travel back. You know the story from last week, how they traveled back to Bethlehem, Naomi and Ruth. So now we pick up the story at chapter 2, verse 1. It starts out, and I'll read it from the ESV translation. It starts out by saying, "Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech." So they're of the same clan. Now that's going to become important to us later on, because remember, Elimelech had land in Bethlehem. When he left, someone else presumably bought it. So someone else owns the Elimelech family land. But remember, according to Jewish law, that land can't stay in the other person's name. The person has to have an opportunity to get the land back. So we'll see that when we go further in Ruth. So now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So we're introduced to another new person, Boaz. And he's a worthy man, which also would mean a wealthy man. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." So she's saying, let me go to work and help support us. I'm young, you're old. And that's a complimentary thing. She does that. Now, before we go any further, let me talk about what she's wanting to do. Now, I want you to picture a grain field. You can picture barley, you can picture wheat, and how it's done is how it's harvested is the cutters, usually young men, go through with something called a sickle. It's a long, curved, maybe a machete type thing if you've never used one. I remember one as a child that we would use. And you go through and you start cutting down the barley stalks and the wheat stalks at the base. So now you have the stalk, maybe it's this high, and it's got the cluster of grains on top of it. what do you do at that particular point? Well, you take it aside and you cut the top off. You cut maybe the top foot off where all the grain is. And when you do that, you bale that. Means you put it in a clump and you tie it up and you leave it outside to dry. That's important. It has to dry. And after that, what you do is you take and you thresh it. Now, thresh it means separating the grain from what's left of the stalk and getting the husk, that's the little fibrous covering on the grain, to come off. And how you do that is you lay them all down on the floor inside a big walled circle. Maybe your wall is 3 feet high. And you lay it down, and this wall might be 50 feet across or 30 feet across or more. And you take an ox, usually that's a pretty strong animal, and you have this ox drag a big flat piece of rock. And it's on ropes, and he drags it over, and what happens is the grain is pulled away from the stalk, number one, and number two, it's compressed, and that cracks the outer husk on it. That's called the chaff. And so now you have a big round thing full of grain covered by chaff and what's left of the stalks. So now what you do is you go in there with a rake and you just scoop up a piece and you throw it up in the air, and because you build your threshing floor, you build it where there's a good breeze on an incline, the wind just blows away all the chaff. Remember about the wind driving away the chaff? In the Psalms, we see that picture. And once you do that, you then bag up the wheat. You pick it all up, the grains, and you put it in bags, and you take it home. And usually what you do is you store it there in big clay jars because they're rodent-proof and they're bug-proof. And that's what you do. So there's an awful lot of work here getting enough grain to make a loaf of bread, or a big loaf of bread. So Ruth is looking for a big job here. Now let's get back to the story. And it says in the last part of verse 2, and she said to her daughter, "Go, my daughter." So she says, "Yes, that's a good idea. Go ahead." And so she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was a clan of Elimelech. Aha. So now we have somebody entered the scene that could act as the Redeemer, and could help get the land back. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." That's a way to introduce yourself to someone, to say hello to somebody. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" Now, there is a cultural situation here. He says, who does this young woman belong to, is what he's really saying. In this culture, it was a patristic culture where the father, the head of the family, was clearly in charge. And so as a daughter, you were either a daughter of someone, then you became a wife of someone, and or if you weren't married, you were someone's servant. If you were a single young woman, you were hooked on to someone as a servant. But you weren't just out there free-floating. That wasn't considered right in this culture. And so it goes on. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is a young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather in the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came and has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." So this woman's a hard worker. Now, what was she doing? You have the reapers out there, and they are cutting down the stalks. And you have other young men and young women that are servants coming behind and bundling them and taking them and storing them. Now, the poor were allowed to go on the corners of a person's field and pick up what was there on the edges. But what's happening here is Ruth is being permitted to follow the people down the field and pick up what they miss, which is a big blessing. That's a big plus. And later we're going to see that change a little bit. So I hope that makes sense to you. Now, there's no romance in this. That's where we get crazy with Ruth. We make it a romance story. It's really not a romance story. It's a story about God blessing someone and blessing them for a very specific reason. Remember, when people were married in the early days, people were married out of commitment. The mother and the father, two sets of parents, got together and said our kids would get along well. And so a marriage was set up, and they got along well because that's what they did in that culture. It wasn't based on the let me go to the dance and see if I can pick a good partner as we do today. We continue. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not glean in another field or leave this one. So he knows about her, and he intentionally starts a dialogue with her. We shouldn't see this as romance. We should see this as him being caring for her, because he is a relative. He's one of the relatives, we're going to learn later, that is responsible to take care of people in the family who are down and out. Listen, my daughter, do not glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. In other words, keep your eyes off the young men. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? So obviously there's a problem here, and later on Naomi says, you want to be careful you stay in Boaz's field, otherwise you'll get molested somewhere. So evidently there was this problem in this culture. And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. And she's just stunned. He's treating her not as a foreigner, but as one of his young women, young servant women who work for him, who are from Bethlehem, who are part of the greater Bethlehem family of people. And she does what's culturally appropriate. She then fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? Now let's stop right there. Why have I found favor in your eyes? There is a word there that we translate favor, that in Hebrew is pronounced like we pronounce the word that describes a female chicken, hen, H-E-N. And that word means undeserved. It means being gracious to someone, whether they've earned it or not. You're just kind, you're polite, and you're pleasant and to people. And that's what we should be. Now, there's another word that we talked about last week called Hesed, that is covenantal love. Hen and Hesed both start with an H, but they have two different meanings. One just means general graciousness. Why are you being kind to me? And the other, Hesed, means you are being kind to me because that is what our contract with God says you're supposed to be. And that's how God acts to us. Okay? So she falls on the ground and says, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner? Now, how does Boaz answer her? Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So what he has basically said here is that he had heard all about how she had made this tremendous commitment to Naomi. She left her country, she left her family, she left her language group, if you will, and she moved to a foreign land where she was an outsider. And she left a country where she had evidently believed in those gods of that country, which would have been Shamash, and she now comes to Israel, and she places herself under the care of Israel. Now you say, Norm, what's going on here? In the ancient world, their religious beliefs were different than ours. Yes, they kind of believed that there was a high God, one God above everyone. But they also believed that there were next level gods, one in charge of each country. And that person was in charge of that physical location. In other words, Moab belonged to the god of the Moabites, Shamash. The Ammonites, living in the land of Ammon, had another god, and so on. And so these gods, you could believe that there were many gods, but that each god took care of his own country. So if you were living in Moab, who did you want to take care of you? You wanted Shamash to take care of you. And that's the way the religion was for most of the Middle East at this particular time, all the way up past the time of Jesus. But the biblical religion, the Jewish religion, is very, very different because there aren't a bunch of equal gods, each running a particular geographical area. There is one God who owns everything. And so that's a little bit different here. And so he is saying here that Ruth has left Moab and the protection of Moab's gods to come to Israel and be under the protection of Israel's God. And so we go on from here. And he says, at mealtime, then she said to him, if I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. So she thanks him again. Now, mealtime comes, and Boaz maybe is kind of getting a little bit more interested. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied and had some left over. And when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. So you can see Boaz is kind of taking care of her. He's showing more interest in her. Now, as we start to get near the end of the chapter, it says, so she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Now, an ephah of barley is about 6 gallons of barley. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to picture a 5-gallon pail like you get from Home Depot, those orange pails, and add another gallon to it. And that's about what Ruth has found, has come up with at the end of the day. She's worked hard all day, and the burden that she carried home was somewhere between 40 and 50 pounds. So she had done an incredible day's worth of work. So we find out something about her work ethic, and I think, this is just an opinion, I think a young woman who's willing to go out and work like that in the field, and you don't hear any whining, any complaining, she just gets it done and does what she has to do, that comes to the attention of people. And I think we should hear that. We're now going to reach a time where a lot of people are going to go back to work. I know I have a couple grandsons who will be working for the summer, and they'll be heading off in a couple of years for college. And we talk about work ethic, and we see that here in Ruth. She is a no complain, no whine, kind of get the job done person, and she does a fabulous job. And the reason they tell us how much she brought in, an ephah of barley, is because that's kind of what maybe 1.5 or 2 people would normally bring in this particular case. So she's a tough bird. And here's what happens. She took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? Where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. In other words, wow, you did a great job, girl. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, the man's name with whom I worked was Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness, there's our hen again, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. In other words, he's not only taking care of us, but he's the guy who can take care of the land, family land as well. Naomi said to her, This man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. Now, let's stop here just for a second. This is a special word in Hebrew, one of our redeemers. It would be more accurate to translate it Kinsman Redeemer. Say that. Kinsman Redeemer. In Hebrew, it's pronounced Goel. And what it means is, if my father died, let me start again. All land is owned by God, especially in Israel. Therefore, God lends the land out, or lets people live on it and use it. But it's ultimately his land, and he partitions this land by tribe, the 12 tribes of Israel, and then within each tribe to the different clans or family groups. Now, Elimelech is in this family group. We're not told which one, but he's in this family group, and Boaz is in it too. And so Elimelech, 12 years before now, doesn't believe the famine's going to change, so he sells his land to someone. We're not told who. And he moves to Moab, where he dies. Naomi comes back, and remember, the land would have gone from Elimelech to Mahlon and Chilion, and then if they died, it would not go to Ruth or to Naomi, it would go to Ruth's children, assuming she marries someone who is from Bethlehem and Jewish. So how does that happen? Elimelech had sold the land, let's say for $1,000. And he sold it to someone who maybe wasn't part of the family of Elimelech. So now, when Naomi comes back with Ruth, if Ruth gets married, there are certain key people in the family that are related called Goels, Kinsman Redeemers. And one of them is supposed to take and buy the land as a gift. Now hear this, as a gift. He can use it for a while, but when he's done, he has to give it to the children of the person who died. So he is the Redeemer, and that's what Boaz is. He is the Kinsman Redeemer. And Naomi says to her, and Ruth said, the Moabite said, beside, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all the harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. You could also translate that molested. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. The wheat and barley harvest, as you know from last time, the barley harvest starts in early May and goes to mid to late May. And then when that stops, the wheat harvest kind of comes in late May and goes to the middle of June. So what we find is Ruth is out there every single day doing this other than the Sabbath. And you say, well, what's Naomi doing at home? Naomi is bagging and bottling and storing this, and also using part of this grain to grind it. She has a grinder at home, which is no small job in itself, and she's making bread. Now, how did she grind it? She has 2 stones, and they're not small. They're about so big for a home, or maybe there was someone in town that helped her do it. But let's say she did it at home, which most people would have done. She would have had 1 stone, maybe 18 inches around, and that stone would have had little grooves all around it, and that stone would have laid on a piece of cloth or burlap, if you will, and there would be another stone on top of it, and that stone would fit, and there'd be sticks around it so they couldn't move, and there'd be a hole in that stone. And then there are actually 2 holes, one to pour the grain into and the other for a stick that you would use to turn this. Now, the bigger the stone, the bigger the stick, and you'd have to walk to turn it. In a mill, an early mill, you would use a mule or an ox to turn it, And here in New Jersey, by the way, just in Galloway Township, we had probably 12 to 15 mills in the Revolutionary and Colonial period, and they used the water power of in the area to do it. And whenever you see a lake, like Lily Lake or the Smithville Lake or any of the other lakes in southern New Jersey, that was once a mill pond, and there was either a grain mill or a sawmill there. Now, what's the story so far? We know they've come back to Bethlehem. They're sitting there. They are living in a house, who knows where at this particular point. And Ruth decides it's time to go to work. So she goes out. She gets to work. She goes into the field, and she meets Boaz, and she really does a great job. And so far, that's all we know. But what we're to see is here God behind the scenes. Very subtly, God is in the whole story. And Elimelech had left God's land when he went to Moab, and that never comes out good in the Bible when you leave God's land. That either is going to bring difficulty on you, or it's a punishment on you. And when the Jews leave to go to Egypt, that ends up not to be a good thing. They end up being in slavery. So now they've come back, and right away you start to hear God mentioned, and Boaz says to his workers, "May God bless you." They repeat back, "And may God bless you." And this whole thing is kind of the idea that this is all happening by chance. That's actually what it says in the first couple of verses, that she happened by chance to go on Boaz's field. But we, the readers, are supposed to say, yeah, some chance. God's behind it, arranging the whole thing. And as next week we go into 3 and 4, we're going to see just how little chance is involved and how much God is involved. But the one thing, things I would like you to see in this chapter is, number one, Ruth is a hard worker. She has a good work ethic. She goes out there, and to put it in modern terms, if she gets paid to do 8 hours worth of work, she does 8 hours work, and she's not hiding, taking breaks every 10 minutes, or on her cell phone the whole time. By the way, if somebody pays you to do 8 hours and you loaf for 4, you have stolen 4 hours. You're a time thief. And you don't want to be that. So do a good job, have a good reputation, and do yourself a favor. When you go to work, when you go back to work, put your phone in your pocket or your pocketbook and leave it there, and don't be checking it all day. People have survived for millennia without cell phones to check. That's not the sign of a godly person that's using their time on the cell phone instead of doing the work they're being paid to do. We also see from Ruth that she's a hard worker, that she's doing a good job, and that brings her to people's attention. When we go to work, we are brought to people's attention one of two ways, either because we do a poor job or because we do a good job. And people who do good jobs generally get ahead, get promoted, get raises. And people that do poor jobs don't get those things. They, in fact, their bosses and their owners look for opportunities to maybe get rid of them and find somebody that will do a good job. It's not good to be a lazy person. Proverbs talks about how bad it is all the time. In fact, Paul even says in the New Testament that if a person is so lazy that they refuse to work, they just want handouts all the time and don't want to do anything about it, that we're not to feed them. Now, that's a tough decision to make right there, but that's what the Bible says. And so we see God at work, thirdly, in the background through just common things, getting ready to bless Ruth's life. You know, as I look back on my life and I see all the things that have happened since I became a believer in 1980, I'm amazed at how God has worked in the background to arrange things. And even when I go back in the part of my life where I wasn't a follower of Jesus, I'm just simply amazed how God put all the pieces in order over the years. Now, I think you have to get a little older to be able to see that, but maybe as you're younger, if you really spend the time and look at it carefully, look at your life carefully, and you can. I didn't really see it until I made a timeline on my life. When I was in graduate school, I was asked to do a timeline of my life because we do that a lot in counseling. And I had to write a line and put 5-year increments on it. And that time I was, I guess, about 40. And so I had these 8 increments. I remembered nothing in the first 0 to 5, but I remembered a few things from 5 to 10, and from 10 to 15 I started to remember a lot more, and so I could fill it in. But I was amazed as I filled it in how I would remember things from before that I didn't think I remembered. And then, what I did is I took it, and since I was living in this area, I was kind of blessed. I had my brother living in Galloway Township at the time, and I had my mom and my grandmother who were living in Atlantic City and who we lived with for a while. And my dad was there for a little bit before he passed, and I could ask them about my life. My aunt was there. I had an aunt and a cousin who were there. And I'd say, tell me about me from 5 to 10. What do you remember? What are the crazy things I did? And the thing that struck me was how much God had really blessed my life. One story really has come back to me, and I'll share it with you and then close. And it talks about how God prepares people. When I was 5 to 10, by the time I was, I guess, 10, I was walking to Sunday school myself, because we walked to school ourselves in those days in Atlantic City, and we were going to Chelsea Presbyterian Church, which was a Bible-believing church on Chelsea Avenue between Atlantic and Pacific Avenues. And I would walk over to church, and I'd be in the Sunday school program, and I lived with my parents and my grandparents. My grandfather had been a professional baseball player, and he was crippled playing a game, and he never walked again, and he was in a wheelchair, and so he couldn't get to church. There were no handicap ramps in those days. His church every Sunday was television, and he Sunday morning watched 2 or 3 shows on television. But anyway, when I would come home, he would say to me, so tell me about the Sunday school lesson, or tell me about the sermon if I had stayed with my mom for church too. And I would tell him all about it. And he said to my parents, unbeknownst to me, I have no idea how God is going to bring it about, because he sure isn't interested in it now. But this young man is going to eventually become a preacher, a minister one day. And so it was when I was in my early 30s, 34, that I came to Christ, and a couple years later was called to ministry. And so my grandfather acted kind of as an unwitting prophet of God, getting the first hint. So God can work out even from we're little children, what he's going to, how he's going to work in our lives when we're adults. So I want you to think about that, and think about, are you being cooperative as God's working in your life, moving you toward these blessings he wants to shower on you, or are you being a pain in the neck? Ask yourself that hard question, and I will see you next week. God bless you. Have a good week. If you have any questions, email me, text me, give me a call, and I'll look forward to seeing you soon. Take care. God bless.